July 4th, 1944. The sky above small-town America cracked open with color streaks of red and gold bursting against the warm summer night. Children tilted their heads back, mouths open in wonder while their parents fanned themselves on wooden porches, the smell of grilled meat drifting lazily through the air. It was Independence Day, a night of pride, laughter, and fireworks that seemed to promise endless freedom. I watched it from behind wire, the celebration so close I could almost taste it, yet separated by a fence that reminded me of everything I had lost. The cheers of families echoed across the fields, but in our camp there was only silence. I had marched through the rubble of Normandy, carried across the Atlantic under jeers and stares, and told myself America would be cruel. I was prepared for beatings, for hunger, for humiliation. Instead, I found myself staring at steady lights at the distant glow of fireworks that celebrated freedom while I sat captive, still wearing the weight of propaganda that warned me I would never leave alive. Each explosion in the sky above Ohio felt like both a blessing and a wound. The beauty of it was undeniable, the joy of the children unmistakable. Yet, inside my chest was a knot of fear. I wondered if my family in Germany could even imagine such abundance if they were alive at all beneath the bombs. That night, I pressed my hands against the rough wood of my bunk and whispered a prayer I barely believed in. The Americans were not what I had been told, and that uncertainty frightened me more than the wire itself. It was the beginning of a story I never expected, one where captivity carried both dread and an unfamiliar, unsettling kindness. The memory of that night with fireworks never left me, not because of the beauty in the sky, but because of the sharp contrast it cast over my own life. While Americans celebrated their freedom with explosions of color, I sat inside wire, still stunned by how far I had traveled to end up there. My journey to this strange land had begun weeks earlier across an ocean I had never imagined crossing, and it carried with it the weight of humiliation, fear, and a gnawing uncertainty that never seemed to leave. We had been taken in France, pulled from the ruins of towns where walls still smoldered and the air reeked of ash. I remember the boots crunching on broken glass, the sound of our own footsteps echoing in lines as soldiers herded us forward. Every step felt heavier, not just because of exhaustion, but because of the shame of captivity. I had worn a uniform once, not as a soldier, but as an auxiliary, a clerk in the machinery of war. That uniform was gone, now replaced by rough fabric that marked me as nothing more than a prisoner. We walked through streets where civilians spat at us, cursed us, threw stones as though we were less than human. It burned inside me, but I kept my head down because anger had no power anymore. At the port, the smell of salt water mingled with sweat and fear. We were packed onto ships, the air below deck, thick with bodies, pressed close together, the groan of metal carrying us farther away from everything familiar. The propaganda I had swallowed for years beat like a drum in my mind. America was cruel. Americans were savages. They would starve us, beat us, make us regret surrendering. Each rumor seemed louder in the silence of that crossing. Some women cried openly. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared into the dark as though already gone. I pressed my knees to my chest and tried to picture my mother's face, but the image blurred under the weight of dread. Days bled into nights. The rocking of the ship was relentless. Food came in small rations, and the air was foul with sickness. I remember lying awake, listening to the muffled sobs of the woman beside me, a nurse from Cologne who clutched a locket as though it were life itself. My own thoughts circled endlessly. What would they do with us? Would we be locked in cages, beaten in public squares, worked until our bones broke? I had believed the stories, and with nothing else to cling to, I expected the worst. When at last the ship slowed and the shouts of sailors rang out, we crowded toward the deck. The coastline rose on the horizon, green and solid, a line of land I had never seen before. My stomach tightened so sharply I thought I would be sick. The fear grew heavier with every mile. America. The very word had been sharpened into a weapon in my mind, a place of brutality, greed, and cruelty. Now it was real, and there was no turning back. The docks came into view, busy with cranes and workers, the noise of industry filling the air. I expected jeers, shouts, curses, like those we had endured in France, but what I found was stranger indifference. Men in uniforms pointed and organized, but they did not spit, they did not strike. We were marched down gangplanks, our feet stumbling on solid ground again, and lined up in rows. Papers were taken photographs, snapped medical checks performed with brisk efficiency. It was not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. That unsettled me more than anything. We were given numbers, tags, and instructions in a language that sounded harsh and clipped to my ears. The guards were stern, their eyes watchful, yet they did not carry the same air of hatred I had braced myself for. It was order, routine, structure, things I had not expected in the hands of an enemy. I clutched the small bag of belongings I still had, little more than a comb, a worn handkerchief, and a letter I dared not read again. Around me, other women looked just as bewildered, their faces pale from weeks of fear. From the port, we were moved inland trains carrying us deeper into the country. Through the windows, I saw fields stretching farther than I could imagine, houses with porches, children running barefoot in yards. They waved at the passing train without knowing who sat behind the glass. I turned my face away, ashamed, though I did not know if it was shame for what we had done, or shame for what I had become. Every mile seemed to pull me farther from the life I had known. And yet there was no cruelty, only the steady rhythm of transport. At last, we reached the camp. Fences rose around neat rows of barracks. Guard towers stood like sentinels, and gates clanged shut behind us. I had braced for cages for filth, for the brutality I had been told to expect. Instead, what I saw unsettled me even more. The camp looked more like a village than a dungeon. Barracks stood in lines, kitchens sent out the smell of cooking food, and there was even a workshop in the corner. The guards were armed, yes, and their eyes never softened. But the place itself was not the nightmare I had imagined. That first night I lay on a bed with clean sheets, my body still trembling with exhaustion, my heart still tight with fear. The contradictions pressed in on me. I was captive, but I was not beaten. I was behind wire, but I was not starving. The fireworks of Independence Day had lit the sky with freedom, and now here I was bound inside fences that felt at once terrifying and strangely orderly. I did not trust it, not yet. Suspicion burned in every breath, in every glance. But as I closed my eyes, the steady rhythm of America's order pulsed around me, and I realized the story I had been told all my life was beginning to fracture. That fracture filled me with unease. I clung to the dread, convinced that cruelty would come tomorrow, if not today. Yet beneath the fear was something I could not name, something unfamiliar that made my chest ache even more than hunger ever had. It was not safety, not hope, not yet. It was the first glimpse of a world I did not understand, and that mystery frightened me more deeply than chains ever could. Life inside the camp revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, and it was nothing like the images I had clung to on the long journey across the ocean. When the gates closed behind us, I expected darkness and cruelty, but what I found unsettled me in a different way. The camp looked more like a village than a dungeon. Neat rows of barracks lined up with fences surrounding them, guard towers rising at the corners, kitchens sending out the steady scent of cooking food. It was captivity, yes, but it carried an order that I could not reconcile with the fear I had brought across the sea. The barracks were plain but solid wooden walls that kept out the wind beds, lined in rows with sheets that were clean though rough. Each woman was given a bunk, a blanket, a small space that was her own. I lay down that first night listening to the quiet hum of voices, the rustle of movement, and realized with a strange heaviness that I was not shivering on the ground. The floor did not smell of filth. The sheets were not crawling with vermin. It was not comfort, but it was not the hell I had been taught to expect. That was its own kind of unease, a kindness that felt dangerous. There were guards, of course. They patrolled with rifles slung across their shoulders, their faces hard, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. The rules were clear: no crossing the fences, no disorder, no resistance. Punishment could come swiftly if the rules were broken, and the towers with their watchful eyes never let us forget that freedom was just a few steps away and utterly unreachable. Yet even within those boundaries, there was a rhythm. 3 meals each day, work details, lights out at night. Everything followed a pattern so steady it almost lulled me into forgetting where I was. The meals were the first shock. We shuffled into the mess hall, trays in hand, and were given portions that, at first, I could not believe were meant for us. Eggs in the morning, potatoes, vegetables, sometimes even meat. Once a soft slice of white bread so light in my hands, I thought it must be a trick. I had not seen bread like that since before the war. At home we rationed every crumb-cut loaves with care to make them last, swallowed ersatz coffee bitter with roasted barley. Here the guards poured real coffee, steaming and dark, and offered sugar as if it were nothing at all. I sat staring at my tray, suspicion gnawing at me. The propaganda echoed in my ears. Americans were monsters. They would starve us, humiliate us, break us. Yet here was food that smelled good, tasted real, filled the hollow ache in my stomach. Some women refused to eat, at first whispering about poison or tricks, but hunger broke defiance quickly. By the third day, most of us ate everything placed in front of us, scraping trays clean with spoons. Each bite was both relief and torment, because as I swallowed, I thought of my family back home, scraping by on watery soups, searching rubble for scraps. That contrast became sharper with each passing week. In Germany, sugar had vanished. Butter was replaced by gray margarine. Meat became memory. I remembered my mother cutting curtains into dresses for my younger sister neighbors, trading ration cards for a handful of turnips, the hollow eyes of children who had forgotten what it felt like to be full. Here behind wire, I received more food than many free people in Europe. It felt obscene, like living in the reflection of a world turned upside down. Work was required, but it was not the kind of brutality I had imagined. Some women were sent to kitchens or laundries, others to repair clothing or clean barracks. I found myself assigned to sewing, mending uniforms with stiff fingers. It was monotonous, but it carried none of the terror I had expected. Guards watched, but they did not shout or strike without reason. There was discipline, yes, but not the systematic cruelty I had braced for. That in itself was disorienting. It left space for thoughts. I did not want to have questions. I dared not whisper even to myself had I been lied to. Evenings brought a strange quiet. After work and meals, we had hours where the camp seemed to settle into its own rhythm. Some women whispered stories in their bunks. Others clutched letters that had arrived weeks or months late, pages blacked out by censors. I remember sitting by the barracks window, looking out through the wire at the fields beyond. Children's laughter carried on the wind from a nearby town. The sound cut deeper than any guard's sneer. It was proof of a life that continued outside of joy that still existed while mine was locked behind fences. The longer we stayed, the more the paradox grew. Captivity brought structure and food, but it also brought guilt. Each time I held a piece of fruit in my hand or stirred sugar into coffee, I thought of my sister at home, of my mother's tired eyes, of the bombs that must have fallen on our street by now. I wondered if they even live still. Survival in America carried a weight heavier than chains, because it meant living better as a prisoner than as a daughter of Germany. The camp itself was tidy, the fences intact, the barracks clean. It was not freedom, but it was not despair either, and that was what made it dangerous. It chipped away at certainties I had once carried like armor. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. The enemy was supposed to hate us. Instead, they gave us soap, clean water, food, enough to fill the belly. It was easier to resist pain than it was to resist kindness. Pain hardened the heart, but kindness left cracks that fear slipped through. Every night I lay in my bunk, torn between relief and dread, my mind filled with images of my family starving while I scraped food from a tray. That contradiction was unbearable, and yet it was inescapable. I pressed my face to the pillow and told myself not to trust what I saw, not to let it soften me. But deep inside, I knew something was shifting. The world was not as I had been told, and that truth frightened me more than barbed wire ever could. The steady rhythm of camp life dulled the edges of fear, but it also sharpened a strange awareness in me. Each day brought meals, work, and nights filled with whispers about home. But one evening, something shifted. It began with rumors soft and unbelievable, passed from bunk to bunk like contraband. Someone said the Americans were preparing a special dessert. Another swore she had seen tubs of ice carried into the kitchen, their lids sealed tight. We laughed bitterly at first. Prisoners did not receive luxuries. The idea itself felt cruel, as though hope was being dangled in front of us like bait. Still, curiosity gnawed at us. When the dinner bell rang, we filed into the mess hall, trays clattering in our hands, our eyes drawn toward the line where guards stood with scoops gleaming under the light. The smell of potatoes and meat filled the room, but another scent lingered faintly in the air. Sweet and foreign. Something that stirred memories I thought I had buried. My stomach twisted. I told myself not to believe it, not to give in to the foolishness of hope. The line moved slowly, each step forward tightening the knot in my chest. I watched as the women ahead of me reached the counter, hesitated, and then stared at their trays with disbelief. And then I saw it with my own eyes, mounds of dark glistening ice being dropped into bowls, the edges softening the surface, shimmering under the heat of the lamps. Ice cream. I had heard of it tasted something faintly similar as a child, at a fair, long before the war, but never like this, chocolate-rich and impossible, something that had vanished from German markets years ago. To see it here in a prisoner's bowl was unreal. When it was my turn, my hands trembled as I held out the tray. The guard, a boy really no older than I was, moved the scoop methodically and let the mound fall into my bowl with a dull thud. For him, it was routine, nothing more than part of his duty. For me, it felt like the earth had tilted. I stared at it, unable to move, terrified that if I blinked, it might disappear. The cold mist clung to the metal, a sheen of melting sweetness gliding across the surface. I carried it carefully to my seat, my legs weak, my heart pounding. Around me, the room filled with murmurs in a dozen dialects, the sound of disbelief, of prayers whispered under breath, of laughter breaking through cracks of fear. Some women stared at their bowls without touching them, convinced it was a trick. Others dipped their spoons with cautious suspicion. I lifted mine slowly, my fingers stiff, my throat dry. The first bite touched my lips, and the shock of cold pierced my teeth, the bitterness of chocolate dissolving into sweetness on my tongue. My eyes stung instantly, and before I knew it, tears blurred my vision. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had felt before. For a moment, the room was filled only with the scrape of spoons and the sound of breath-catching. Then came the release. A secretary from Hamburg laughed aloud, the sound bubbling out of her like she had forgotten how to hold it in. A nurse from Bremen pressed her face into her hands and sobbed quietly, her shoulders trembling. Another woman muttered bitterly that nothing in Hitler's Germany had ever tasted like this, and her words hung heavy in the air, half truth, half betrayal. I ate slowly, each bite both joy and guilt. The chocolate melted too quickly, leaving a sweetness that clung to my tongue and refused to fade. I thought of my family in Germany, of my sister's hollow cheeks, of my mother boiling watery soups with turnips and barley. I thought of children who had never known the taste of chocolate at all. To savor it here in captivity, while they starved at home, was unbearable. And yet I could not stop. My spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl until there was nothing left, only the taste of longing. Laughter and tears mingled across the hall. One woman joked that the Americans were trying to break our teeth with frozen stone. Another said if Hitler had promised chocolate ice cream for all, perhaps she would have followed him longer. The irony cut deep, but for a few minutes we laughed together, the sound rolling unevenly, carrying with it a strange kind of relief. Guards watched from the corners, some grinning, others shaking their heads, as if baffled by the sight of their prisoners crying over dessert. To them it was ordinary, the stuff of hot afternoons and childhood summers. They could not understand the enormity of what it meant to us. That night, lying in my bunk, I could still taste it. My lips tingled with the memory, my heart ached with the weight of it. It was not just food, it was proof that the world I had been taught to hate could be kinder, stranger, and richer than I had ever imagined. It was a fracture in everything I had believed, a sweetness that pierced through layers of fear and left me raw. I wept quietly, clutching the blanket to my face, unsure if I cried for the taste itself or for the realization that my children back home might never know it. The next day the camp returned to its routine, the same fences, the same guards, the same rules. But the memory of chocolate ice cream lingered, spoken of in whispers, replayed like a dream, too vivid to forget. Some dismissed it as an indulgence, a trick meant to soften us. Others cherished it secretly, hiding the memory like contraband in their hearts. For me, it became something larger. It was not the dessert itself that mattered, but what it revealed, the terrifying possibility that the propaganda had lied, that the enemy could offer sweetness instead of cruelty, that the world was wider and more complicated than the narrow cage I had once believed in. That thought unsettled me more than the barbed wire ever could. Because pain, I knew how to endure. Hunger, I understood. But kindness, sweetness, the shock of chocolate melting on my tongue that was harder to bear. It opened a door inside me that I had no way to close again. The memory of the chocolate ice cream did not fade with the morning. It lingered on my tongue like a ghost, both sweet and heavy. And as the camp returned to its steady rhythm, I felt the weight of it pressing harder against my chest. Each meal afterward seemed richer than the last, not because the food had changed, but because my awareness had. I could not take a bite without imagining my family back in Germany scraping together whatever they could find. Boiling watery soups, stretched with turnips, rationing bread so thin it crumbled between their fingers. I ate eggs in the morning, sometimes even sausages, and felt shame burn inside me as though every mouthful betrayed the people I loved most. That contradiction became the center of my days. Hunger had once been constant, gnawing at me so fiercely that I dreamed of food. Now, for the first time in years, my stomach was full, but my heart was empty. Each spoonful carried guilt. I thought of my sister, her thin arms, her hollow cheeks, the way she would look at me if she knew I had eaten ice cream while she starved. The sweetness of captivity became more bitter than any punishment could have been. The Americans seemed unaware of this torment. To them, food was ordinary. Coffee was poured freely, sugar stirred in, without thought, milk delivered without ration cards. Once in the mess hall, I caught myself staring at the casual way a guard spooned sugar into his cup. 3 heaping spoons, as though it were endless. I remembered the last time I had seen sugar in Germany, my mother dissolving the tiniest pinch into boiling water so my sister could taste something sweet on her birthday. The memory struck me so hard I had to look away, pressing my nails into my palms to stop the tears from falling. Life in the camp was not only about food, though food remained the sharpest reminder of difference. There were other experiences, each one jarring in its own way. We were given access to books, magazines, even newspapers. I remember holding an American magazine in my hands, its pages glossy, filled with images of women in dresses that flowed with fabric we had long since sacrificed for bandages or curtains. Lipstick cars, smiling faces untouched by war. It felt like looking into another world, one that continued untouched while mine crumbled. I traced the lines of the pictures with my fingers torn between envy and disbelief. There was music, too. Some evenings, voices rose in song choirs formed by prisoners or records played by the Americans. The sound carried across the wire, lifting into the night air. I would close my eyes and let it wash over me, the notes stirring memories of concerts I had once attended in grand halls back home. Memories of laughter and youth, before war hollowed everything out. And yet the joy of music here was painful. I thought of the silence back in Germany. The streets darkened, the homes reduced to rubble. And it felt cruel that I could hear harmony and captivity while my family heard only the wail of sirens. The strangest of all were the moments when the Americans tried to share their own lives with us. Baseball, for example. To us, it looked ridiculous at first, a game of standing still, and then suddenly running, of swinging wooden bats awkwardly at a ball. But the guards played with such boyish enthusiasm, shouting, laughing, their joy filling the air. Sometimes they even invited us to watch. I remember the first time I stood near the fence watching the ball arc high into the sky, the cheer that erupted as it landed. For a moment, I almost smiled, and then guilt struck me again. How could I find amusement here, while my brother fought, perhaps already dead, on the Eastern Front? How could I allow myself to be warmed by the laughter of my captors? And yet there were times I could not resist. Once a guard offered me a Coca-Cola in exchange for helping with a sewing repair. I held the bottle in my hands, its shape strange, its contents fizzing against the glass. When I tasted it, the sweetness was sharp, biting against my tongue like champagne bubbling into my throat. I laughed aloud in surprise, and the sound startled me. I had not laughed like that in years, but the joy faded, quickly replaced by shame. I imagined my mother's face if she knew I had sipped an American drink while she rationed barley coffee back home. The contradiction tore at me, leaving me restless long after the taste was gone. Night after night, these feelings built like a tide inside me. Joy tangled with guilt, relief shadowed by grief. I began to see my own face in the women around me, smiles breaking through only to collapse into tears, laughter followed by silence. We carried the same paradox: fed while our families starved, sheltered while our homes were destroyed, offered kindness by the very people we were taught to despise. Some women hardened themselves against it, refusing to speak English, refusing to taste the luxuries. They whispered that it was all a trick, that cruelty would come later. I envied their certainty. For me, the cracks had already formed. At times, the guilt became unbearable. Letters from home arrived months late, ink-smudged sentences blacked out by censors, but the words that did make it through were enough to break me. News of bombings, of streets destroyed, of neighbors lost. One letter told me my cousin had died in an air raid, another that food had nearly run out. I read those words while sitting on a bench after dinner, my belly uncomfortably full. I wanted to empty it out, to undo what I had eaten, because how could I swallow meat and bread while she had starved in the dark? In those moments, I wished for cruelty. Cruelty would have made sense. Cruelty I could have resisted, held in my heart as proof of the enemy's nature. But kindness, even accidental kindness, was harder. It forced me to question, to reflect, to see the possibility that the world was not divided as neatly as I had been taught. That realization frightened me more than hunger or pain. It meant that I had lived inside lies, and that my suffering was not the same as my family's. It meant that even in captivity, I was living better than they were. The ice cream had been the first fracture, but it was everything that followed. Coca-Cola fizzing on my tongue, baseball laughter echoing across the yard, the weight of books in my hands, the sweetness of sugar stirred into coffee that deepened the crack. Each experience carved into me, leaving me unsteady, restless, torn between gratitude and guilt. At night, I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, the sounds of the camp settling into silence, and wondered if I would ever escape this contradiction. Even if the war ended, even if I went home, I knew I would carry it with me, always the memory of being full, while my family starved the taste of sweetness, while the world I had known crumbled into ash. The contradictions of camp life deepened with every passing season, and by the time spring returned, the air carried more than the scent of blooming fields. It carried whispers, fragments of news that drifted in through guards' conversations, Red Cross bulletins, and censored letters. Germany was faltering. The Reich that had been proclaimed eternal was collapsing in fire and rubble. Rumors ran like fever through the barracks. Berlin was burning. Hitler was dead. The war itself was unraveling. Each word landed like a stone in my chest. I should have felt relief, but instead, I felt hollow. Defeat was real, and with it came fear of what waited beyond the wire. We gathered in small groups at night, our voices hushed, our eyes searching each other's faces for answers none of us had. Some wept openly, mourning not just their nation, but the families they knew they might never see again. Others clung to bitterness, refusing to believe, until the final surrender was spoken aloud. For me, the uncertainty gnawed deeper than hunger ever had. I had lived for years inside a structure of belief, convinced that sacrifice would mean victory, that suffering had purpose. Now that foundation was gone, replaced by nothing but questions. What would become of us when the war ended? Would we be sent home? And if so, what would home even mean anymore? In those final months, the camp felt strangely suspended between worlds. The fences still stood, the guards still patrolled, the meals still arrived with military precision. Yet everything was shifting beneath the surface. We began to see the soldiers not as faceless enemies, but as men tired and eager to go home themselves. Some exchanged names with us. Small kindnesses passed across a gulf that once seemed unbridgeable. We noticed the way they missed their families, the way they laughed at the same jokes we did. It was a slow erosion of certainty, and it frightened me more than the barbed wire ever had. When Germany finally surrendered the air inside, the camp grew heavy with silence. Some women fell to their knees, others clutched each other and sobbed, their tears spilling into the dirt. A few stood stiff with pride, refusing to bend, even as their nation crumbled. I felt only exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep into every corner of my being. The war that had defined my life was over, and I did not know who I was without it. What unsettled me most was the paradox of safety. The camp, for all its fences and watchtowers, had become a strange refuge. I was fed, clothed, even given books and music. I was sheltered from bombs, from the chaos that tore through my homeland. Beyond the wire lay a country that had not known hunger or fire, where children grew up with baseball and Coca-Cola. Within the wire, I had known contradictions that left me restless. But what waited after release terrified me more. To leave captivity meant to return to ruins, to rationing, to streets blackened by ash. The thought of walking back into that world made the fences seem almost protective. When the time for repatriation came, we packed what little we had: letters, sketches, fragments of memory, and boarded ships once more. The journey felt colder this time, heavier. As the coastline of America faded into the distance, I felt an ache I could not name. I was leaving captivity, yet I was also leaving behind the only stability I had known in years. It was a bitter irony. I had come here expecting cruelty and found something I could not define, and now I was returning to freedom that tasted like loss. Landing in Germany was like stepping into another life. The docks were crowded, with broken faces. The air filled with the scent of smoke and ruin. Streets I had once known were reduced to rubble, neighbors gone, families scattered. Hunger pressed against me again, sharp and relentless, but this time it carried no shame, only despair. I thought of the meals in the camp, of sugar stirred into coffee, of the sweetness of chocolate melting on my tongue. The memory burned like fire, both comfort and torment. In the years that followed, the camp became a ghost I carried within me. I rarely spoke of it yet. It surfaced in quiet moments: the sound of laughter during a baseball game, the fizz of a bottle of Coca-Cola, the faint strains of a song sung under a summer sky, and always the taste of ice cream, that impossible sweetness that had broken something inside me. It was not the food itself that haunted me, but what it had revealed: that the world I had been taught to hate was capable of kindness, and that small mercies could undo the walls built by propaganda more effectively than whips or starvation ever could. I often wondered if my sister would have understood, if my mother would have forgiven me for eating while they starved. I wondered if they could have seen that the enemy was not the monster we had been told. The guilt never left me, but neither did the memory of humanity, glimpsed in the unlikeliest of places. A spoonful of ice cream, a smile from a guard, a book placed in my hands. These were small things, but together they shook the foundation of everything I had believed. As I grew older, I came to see that captivity had not only confined me, but transformed me. The fences had fallen long ago, yet the lessons remained: that cruelty is easy to resist, but kindness demands reflection. That survival is more than hunger and shelter. It is the reckoning with truth when it arrives in unexpected forms. The war ended, the world moved on, but I carried within me the tears I shed over chocolate ice cream, the laughter that slipped through my lips against my will, and the haunting realization that humanity can surface even in the darkest of times. It is that memory that lingers most of all. Not the sound of bombs, not the hunger of childhood, not even the barbed wire itself, but the sweetness of a moment that revealed both the depth of what had been lost and the fragile possibility of what might still be possible. In the end, what remains is not the fences, the guards, or even the routines of captivity, but the quiet moments that unsettled everything I thought I knew. A spoonful of chocolate ice cream, a bottle of Coca-Cola, the sound of a baseball game drifting across the yard. These were not grand gestures, yet they carved deeper wounds and offered sharper revelations than any weapon could. I came to America expecting cruelty, and found a paradox instead: to live in safety, while my family starved; to laugh under watchtowers, to taste sweetness in defeat. That contradiction never left me. When I returned home, I carried more than guilt. I carried the memory of small mercies that pierced through walls of propaganda, the realization that kindness could be more disarming than brutality. The ruins of Germany were my inheritance, but so was the knowledge that humanity can flicker even in war, that even enemies are capable of gestures that change the heart. It is a memory that still stirs unease, but also a fragile hope. Because if ice cream could bring tears in a prison camp, then perhaps life, even after war, could still hold unexpected sweetness.